Hello, all my students. This week we're going to be talking about identity as well as culture. Other people sign identity this way. You see other signs for identities like this. Some sign identity like this. I actually sign it like this. That's my preferred sign choice. And then as well as communication within the deaf community. Now, we have a continuum, and the continuum is ASL to English, and along that continuum we have other different things that are contained within that continuum. So I want you to picture it. So you have ASL and it goes all the way to English, and within that continuum of language use you have to realize there's so many deaf people that actually fit into that continuum. They have different deaf learners, different people that are out there that have all kinds of different language use, as well as the invented sign systems that have also been thrown into the mix of language. And so that has definitely made things more convoluted. We also have the continuum of hearing loss. Oh my gosh, I just signed hearing like a hearing person. I meant the actual loss of your hearing. So that means it could be anywhere from mild to profound. And because we have so many diverse people out there, each person's language is going to be different. Within that continuum, we have ASL to English. Now keep in mind of that. And then we also have PSE. PSE typically is kind of in the middle of the continuum. It has ASL features with English word order, and sometimes it's closer to the English side, as well as we have English signs. Then we also have oral communication, where the people speak only, that's all they do, and they also read lips. And then we have cued speech. So what's interesting is that all the different cultures out there, they all have different identities, and within the deaf community, you just have to think of how they label themselves. Like if you look at yourself, remember last week we talked about culture as well as identity. It's the same concept with any culture, any community. Everybody labels themselves or has a label. It's important that we are aware of that and we know the labels that are out there. And society loves to label people. If we are not labeled, typically you don't fit in the box that society wants you to fit in. And society as a whole cannot handle that, and it's not typically accepted. Sometimes the label that the person has, or identity that the person has labeled themselves, doesn't always fit your typical ideal situation. Now, when you talk about the different perspectives, I'm going to talk about two distinct perspectives. I'm going to talk about the hearing view versus the deaf view. So the hearing view, they look at deafness as an impairment or a disability. They feel like deaf people need to be fixed. They typically call deaf people hearing impaired. They do not label them as deaf or identify them as a deaf person. If that person is deaf, then that means that they're not going to be on the same level as other people. They can't function on the same level as other people in the hearing world. So you have mild, moderate, severe, and profound. Those are the four different labels for hearing loss. Now, people will, especially the hearing people, they will call people hearing impaired, especially whenever you have mild or moderate hearing loss. Those call you hard of hearing. And if they label you as deaf, they are actually meaning you have either severe or profound hearing loss, so then that means you're deaf and you cannot hear at all. Audiologists believe and only focus on the actual decibels, And so they really solely focus on how much hearing is left and how much hearing loss you don't have. That is their job, and that's what they focus on. Now, in the hearing world, we typically call that the pathological view, because you're looking only at that person's ears and their amount of hearing, and they don't look at the person as a whole. That's how it's actually defined. Now, let's talk about the deaf view and the deaf perspective. The labels are drastically different. As a deaf person, they have their own labels and identity that they would actually call themselves. And we have to understand as an interpreter that we have to accept those identities just like other people have to accept identities of myself or other people out in society. And it's not for us to judge. Deaf people, they value those experiences that they have in life, especially if like you have a deaf family member. It's a huge honor to have that within the deaf world. Deaf people also want to know what school you went to, because they'll know your style and your background, and they'll know just kind of the person you are from where you went to school. They also they like to find out if you were born deaf or how you lost your hearing loss, because they have that same shared experience with each other. So culturally, that's very important. They also typically will ask when you started signing. If you meet a deaf person and a deaf person is talking to another deaf person for the first time, they'll, give them the riot act. I mean, they just ask them tons of questions, but this is very culturally acceptable. So you say, we're going to talk about attitudinal perspective. That means your attitude based in the deaf world. So if you label yourself as being hard of hearing, that means you definitely are not accepting the deaf person's view of being culturally deaf. And so that means that they're not also accepting themselves as a whole, and they're not accepting their deafness. Sometimes interpreters will say, oh, that person talks on the phone. They are not deaf. But we are not ones to judge. We cannot do that. That is not for us to do at all. There are deaf people that do have phones, and some do hear, and they're able to use phones and function with a phone. And they can call people, just like one of my friends. She calls me all the time on her phone. She has hearing loss, but yet she is labeled and identified as a deaf person. There are those deaf persons that are out there. It's not based off of the hearing, the actual physical hearing loss they have, but they're still labeled as deaf. Sometimes people will label themselves as hard of hearing or hearing impaired, and they might even have profound hearing loss. But it's about how they're identifying in the deaf world. You have to remember that that's possibly the pathological perspective. Your identity in the deaf world will also show how tightly knit you are with them. If you're not in the deaf world and you have hearing loss, sometimes you try to find a good fit. And sometimes they're raised in the hearing world and they don't ever get to be a part of the deaf world until they go to college. Maybe they go to Gallaudet for the first time, and that's when they change their whole identity. And that's totally possible. This happens. Other people that have hearing loss, like for example, like for myself, okay, I have hearing loss. I'm hearing, but I have a hearing loss, and I could label myself as deaf, but I don't feel like that identity is correct. I'm a working interpreter, but I have hearing loss, and I could label myself as deaf because I'm in the deaf world, I sign, I am involved I have deaf friends and family. So I definitely could label myself or identify as a deaf person, but I don't. So that's me. If the person is hard of hearing, or if they label themselves as hearing impaired, normally that means that they are more in the hearing world and they don't necessarily have those shared experiences with other deaf people. They share the thoughts and ideals of the hearing world. They might, come into the deaf world once in a while, but they are not deeply rooted in the community. Cultural identity, you have to think, okay, so if you hear the word hearing impaired, culturally deaf people do not like that word. They hate it, as a matter of fact. They detest it because that labels them as being impaired of some way, and they are not impaired. Remember that when we were talking about that continuum, right? The ASL and English continuum. Deaf people out in the deaf world in the community use so many different ways of communicating. You have to remember the diverse community. Remember everybody's background is different. So you're going to have to work within that continuum. ASL, you have to remember that it has some, let me tell you some points of the language. It has facial, grammatical structure. It has linguistic information. It has finger spelling. It has signing symmetry. You have to remember that it has all of these different key points within the language. ASL has its own grammatical structure. A lot of times you see videos out there in the world on YouTube and stuff, it'll say, this is an ASL music interpreted song, da-da-da-da-da. But if you actually look at the grammatical structure of ASL from like a linguistic book, and you saw that person's signs, they're actually not following it grammatically, and normally they're in the more PSE or English side of the continuum of language. They are not signing ASL typically. Okay, so it has its own rules, pragmatics, syntax. ASL has all of that. It's all intact. In the deaf community, it's accepted and is the primary language for that community. And ASL is very, very important in the deaf world. Years ago, and unfortunately still today, the hearing people look at ASL and feel like it's not a worthy language. They feel that it is poorly used, that it's a slang, that it's not a real language. Of course, that's not true. We have tons of research to back it up from many linguists who have studied for years upon years, actually saying that ASL is a functional and solid language, and it can have abstract ideas. It can be just as equal as any other language. But unfortunately, the hearing community feels that English is superior over ASL. ASL also is used in social settings. Remember that all language has its own arbitrary symbols, and it has specific grammatical structure, and it also has its own tones, or the way that things are pronounced, the phonetics. It also has pragmatics. If you were to put down like an A, like a bird is dead, right? You would know that the rule would be that you would have to do a period, or you could do an exclamation based off of the rules that you know grammatically in English. The same thing with ASL. You would have to say bird there, dead, finished. That would grammatically be following ASL. It is equivalent, but the grammar is drastically different. I'm going to let you go ahead and read about syntax from the PowerPoint. It has all the definitions on there. Remember that phonological means that that's how you actually say the words, but in sign language we have a part of the language which is movement. Depending on how you move the word is what's going to change the meaning. Again, semantics, I want you to read that, read all about that. Also pragmatics, just read the PowerPoint. It's pretty much stated there in the PowerPoint. Now, I want to talk to you about the signing systems that are in existence. These were all invented signing systems, and they are not a language, okay? It is not a language. Keep that in mind. You have to understand the difference. Sign language, such as ASL, versus all of the different sign systems that are out there. It is drastically different, and there's 5 signing systems that were created. The Rochester method, that meant that you finger spelled everything, every single word. The reason that they invented this system is they thought that if you finger spelled everything, it would increase your knowledge and you would be more intelligent by doing that. And still today, there are a couple, there's still several pockets of Rochester method deaf people, especially in the senior citizen world. They definitely use that, and it's quite daunting. I want you to go ahead and read the other signing systems. They're all kind of like listed there. C1, let me tell you about that. They thought that if you went ahead and taught, not the syllabus, I just said syllabus. Oh my gosh, I'm so silly. They thought that if you notice the parts of words, like they would say but, fly, or they would say car, and then like a pet, like you're gonna pet someone, so it would be carpet. They thought that you would acquire the language faster, but it actually caused a lot more confusion for deaf, and there are several school districts that still use C1 today, unfortunately. The other signing systems, there's signing exact English, that's C2. That is what you see in many of the music videos. A lot of the music videos, that's what it's in, like cut it out, where you're actually cutting something instead of signing stop it. Or sometimes they'll say stop horsing around, and it's like stop and with the horse, and it goes around. Like it doesn't make any sense. That's what you see on the videos. Again, all of these are different sign systems that were invented to help deaf people learn English. They thought it would be easier for them to actually acquire the language that way. Same thing. Just kind of read all the slides. All the information is pretty self-explanatory. The interpreters invented CASE. It's not a language, but it's a way. It's a mode of communication. Okay, so what that means is that there are a lot of people that actually use CASE. It's conceptually accurate signed English. That means that it's an English word order, but the concepts are correct. Now we're going to talk about code switching. Some people will sign this for code switching. Deaf people typically do this with hearing people. If there's a group, a whole room of deaf people, and they're all talking to each other, when a hearing person gets there, typically the deaf person will turn off their ASL and they'll go and slide into the more PSE mode to ensure communication for that hearing person. Deaf people code switch all the time, and they're actually trying to help us as hearing people to understand. Now, when we're talking about English, English influences ASL, as well as ASL can influence English. That just happens with language. We also have lexical borrowing. That means other countries have specific words, and we would use different words like before, like this was the sign for Russia, right? But now we found out their sign is Russia, like this. So that's lexical borrowing. We're borrowing that lexical from their word, their world. There's other things that are listed that aren't, were put down, like the foreign languages, as well as home signs and gestures. Like for me, we sign punch for the drink, and then we also have Kool-Aid. We sign color drink for Kool-Aid at our home. That's our home signs. We also do this. That's the sign for Sprite in our home. I'm trying to remember all the other ones. Those were our home signs that we used in our home with my deaf family. There are also some deaf people that have never been exposed to any language, so they call them minimal language skills, which means that that person has not been exposed to language. It does not mean that they are dumb by any way, but that they've just been maybe severely isolated. They have not been able to actually socialize with other people. Sometimes people will keep them locked away, especially in other cultures and other countries. And so they have limited communication, so you would have to communicate more gesturally. Then you also have an oral deaf person. They could have oral with sign support, or they might only read lips, so you have to learn as an interpreter to enunciate everything clearly on your mouth. And then you have cued speech, that's 7 hand shapes, and it represents each syllable. And then you have deaf blind. That community has, low vision, high vision, but it could also have tactile signing. So there's all those different groupings of deaf blind people out there as well. And of course, you can read about MLS people, but we actually call it high learners, high visual learners, actually. So they're more visually inclined to learn faster and easier through visual language versus on a paper. When you're working with minimal language skilled persons, I typically always want a deaf interpreter with me because deaf people have it innately within them, and they're able to code switch and match up and be able to meet that person's needs faster than us as hearing persons. So always, if you can, if you have a minimal language skill consumer, please bring a deaf person like a CDI with you, a certified deaf interpreter, because they can definitely support the communication and never feel intimidated from them. Learn from the CDIs. Deaf people teach us, they teach us so much. And so when we become certified, a lot of times we think, oh, we don't need deaf people anymore. Their word is not valued anymore. But they teach you everything that you need to know. Don't shut them out. Always, always welcome them. Welcome a deaf person. Don't feel intimidated by their presence. That person is trying to communicate and help deaf people communicate, and that's our goal. And some interpreters, it's important that we have the CDIs. It's so important that we use a CDI, that we're working with them, because they have this great skill set that we don't, and that's our whole point. As interpreters, we want to have effective communication, so please welcome CDIs anytime that you can work with them. Thank you so much. Thank you for this week. See you next week.